Welcome to the European Forum for Urban Security's Secure for All podcast. Secure for All aims to empower local and regional authorities to ensure the security of soft targets and public spaces against potential threats. In each of these episodes, experts from our consortium join to explore a different aspect of making and keeping public spaces open, accessible and safe for everyone. Now, in order to fix problems in your public spaces, you need to know what those problems are to begin with. In other words, you need to know what and where your vulnerabilities are. And we thought, what better way to start this series than by talking to an expert in vulnerability assessments. So, with me today is Vivian Gravenberg of the Dutch Institute of Technology, Safety and Security. Welcome, Vivian. Could you start us off by telling us a little bit about the Institute and your role in it?
So the Dutch Institute of Technology, Safety and Security, short DITS, specializes in innovative European projects within the field of criminology, protection of public spaces, within the field of AI, all for use by LIAs, local and national governments. And I'm a Master of Science in Investigative Criminology, and I specialize in environmental criminology. And that is actually the study of the factors that have a lot of influence on not only the environment of a perpetrator, but also the environment of a victim, the environment of a certain place, and the sociological environment and the psychological environment of both perpetrators and victims.
What interested you in Secure for All, and why did you decide to join the consortium?
We have a lot of expertise in conducting vulnerability assessments and, of course, expertise in environmental criminology, which is a very important theoretical background for vulnerability assessment. So my expectations for the Secure for All project are actually that we can help local municipalities and authorities conduct these vulnerability assessments. And we will also explain the general helicopter view of risk assessment. And we hope that we can help create more resilience against all types of threats in public spaces.
Great. Then let's jump right into the content side of it all. Could you situate us a little bit here? What does a criminologist first think of or focus on when asked about vulnerability of public spaces in a city?
Vulnerability is a trait to a certain public space of interest, is what we call it. Public spaces of interest can be all types of places where many people gather and where the risks for any type of crime happening are very large. For instance, shopping malls, squares, transport hubs, places of worship, etc. And what makes a place vulnerable is actually the absence of what we call a capable guardian. And a capable guardian can be surveillance by LIAs, for instance, or surveillance by private security companies, or CCTV surveillance, or cool AI stuff that can protect a certain place from any type of threat.
By LIAs, you mean law enforcement agencies?
Yes, those can be police officers, ministries of justice, etc., all throughout Europe.
You already mentioned the absence of a capable guardian, so let's take that one head on. What makes a space vulnerable, and how do you know that?
I think there are a lot of characteristics that can make a certain location vulnerable. That's why we always advise to conduct a proper risk assessment and a proper vulnerability assessment. What I can tell is the general helicopter view that I tried to explain in Secure for All is there is this very famous criminological theory, which is called routine activity theory. And what it says is that if there's an opportunity, every individual will most likely seize that opportunity. So you can use that for normal psychological behaviors, but you can also display that on criminal behavior. And what that says is that there are three elements to every crime. So we have suitable target. That's what a vulnerable target actually is. We also have a motivated offender. And then on top of the suitable target and the motivated offender, we also have the absence of a capable guardian. So those three elements together form the perfect situation to commit a crime. So what this theory actually explains is that if at least two of the three or all three elements are present, the likelihood of any criminal activity happening is very high. And then using that helicopter view, we explain how to then start with risk assessment. And vulnerability assessment is a small part of risk assessment.
So how does risk assessment then work in practice? Could you walk me through the steps?
In short, you have a risk assessment process, and the risk assessment process describes that you have 3 steps in risk assessment. You have risk identification, for instance, okay, what makes a certain place interesting to commit a crime? Then you analyze the risks. So you can make, for instance, a risk matrix where you calculate the likelihood of a certain risk happening, and you weigh in all types of threat scenarios. For instance, okay, so how high would the risk be for a weapons attack? How high would the risk be for a vehicle attack? Or how high would the risk be for a sexual crime? And what is interesting is that the risks and vulnerabilities are different for the same place throughout different forms of crime. So I'll give you a short example. A vulnerability against a terrorist attack can be a very crowded park during the day, because the goal of a terrorist attack often is to make as many victims as you can. But that same park for a sexual offender would not form a vulnerability, because a sexual offender will not likely commit a crime during the day in a crowded park, but they will at that same park at night when there are no cameras or no gates, for instance. So what we try to explain is that risk identification, so identifying the risks, should not be a one-time thing. It should be a continuous process, and you should always identify the risks for all types of criminal threats. So again, you have risk identification, then you have risk analysis, and then you have risk evaluation.
So dealing with vulnerability requires all the 3 layers that you just described.
Exactly. Yes.
But it kind of sounds like the politically most interesting part only happens at the end when all the data is collected and analyzed. Is that correct?
The evaluation is the most important part. So that's where you say, okay, I have identified these vulnerabilities and possible risks. Do I think that we have to take action? Or can we say, well, I think we can manage? For instance, a decision can be, okay, well, we think that the risks during the night are very, very high, but during the day they're not so high. So we will just find some solutions for during the night.
So when you say we, could you specify that a little bit? Who is meant by that? Who makes those choices?
What we as DITS advise is to always have someone in the field of security as a managing body, or someone that is very known to that specific public space of interest I earlier mentioned. For example, take a place of worship. We have a church leader, and he wants to assess the risks and the vulnerabilities for his church. So what we then advise is that this church leader is the actual person that starts organizing the vulnerability assessment, but he needs to find experts throughout the field to help him fill out that vulnerability assessment, because you will have to answer questions regarding security, regarding local laws, regarding previous security measures, the environment. What we advise is local stakeholders such as private security companies, law enforcement agencies, maybe local commerce that are also in the same area that might have interesting CCTV cameras already hanging there, for instance. It's better to work together than to reinvent the wheel. And what we also always advise is a social organization in the neighborhood that knows who is in the neighborhood, because these organizations, of course, know exactly what happens in the streets and why certain people can be more vulnerable than other people, because we also know from a general helicopter view in crime that most crimes happen within a radius of a kilometer around the homes of the perpetrators. So it's interesting to know who lives in your neighborhood if you're trying to assess, okay, what are the risks? But it differs per soft target that you're investigating.
So let's focus a little more on that term soft target here. What actually makes a site or a target soft? Is that softness a negative thing, or how are we supposed to think about it?
What makes it soft is actually what is sometimes so beautiful about it, because it's a very open space. So the definition of public space is that it has to be freely accessible to everyone. But that also makes it very vulnerable, because it's accessible to anyone. And that is why you always have to look at soft targets, not only from the perspective of the public, but also from the perspective of a perpetrator. What would make this public space of interest the perfect, suitable target to commit a crime? And what is absent in its guarding? So do we have cameras? Do we have fences around? If I take a beautiful park in a city somewhere, are there fences around the park? Are there cameras? Is there a cop walking by every 30 minutes? So those I would call capable guardians. And the absence of those capable guardians and the open character of a lot of public spaces is what makes them vulnerable, unfortunately.
So does that mean that the fix for a soft target is to harden it then?
I don't prefer to speak about target hardening because I prefer to speak about increasing its resilience against certain threats.
Well played.
Yeah.
Okay, so when you're training people to do a vulnerability assessment, when you're trying to convey these skills, what do you need to look out for? What are some problems or pitfalls you need to keep in mind?
I think one of the common, well, I wouldn't call it a mistake, but I think it's just a lot of information to process for people that don't have a lot of expertise assessing vulnerabilities or assessing risks. I think a common mistake in giving those trainings can be to make it too technical. When I was talking about the case, for instance, for a place of worship, a priest has no previous experience in securitization. So I think it's super important to explain the general helicopter view. And then when they see this vulnerability assessment, which is a huge Excel document, then they will understand the helicopter view a bit more, I think. And what we try to do is to explain how you can fill out this huge vulnerability assessment tool. I will not explain them in detail right now, but what we do is to try to really carry them through these steps of filling out the vulnerability assessment. And I think that is super important because people tend to underestimate it because they hear, oh, it's an Excel sheet. And then they think, oh, we will do that in 5 minutes. Last workshop I gave was 4 hours. So it's a very difficult process, but it's so valuable and so important because if you have identified these vulnerabilities, and if you even identify them for one main scenario, for instance, for a weapons attack, the chances of you mitigating possible risks for other types of threats are very high. So if you, for instance, take action upon that weapon scenario and you start to hang up cameras and security measures at the door and you provide security guard, then you automatically weapon yourself against other types of threats. So we just try to explain how important it is, why it has to be so long, but that it's so important that you fill it out with all of your attention.
Let's stick with that element of audience and stakeholder interaction for a moment. As you said, people might not have much experience with systematically assessing risks, but most people probably do have a pretty clear idea of what they worry about. What do you do if those two areas get into conflict with one another, the objective and the subjective level? How do you navigate that?
In my career, I haven't witnessed such a situation yet, but I can imagine that it will happen, of course, that a certain managing body is conducting a vulnerability assessment based on his general idea of him or her being vulnerable to, for instance, terrorist attacks. And then we conduct the vulnerability assessment, and then we find out that the chances of a terrorist attack occurring are near to zero, but the chances of robbery, theft, or any other type of criminal threat are very high. Then I think that vulnerability assessment has completely fulfilled its goal, because what you are doing is assessing the vulnerabilities to your place. I think it's just very valuable in all situations. But it is always up to the managing body that has organized the vulnerability assessment to decide how to evaluate the risks and the vulnerabilities that he has identified. So we can just help identify vulnerabilities. We can help explain what the options are, what actions you can take, how important it is to take action. We will also advise if we see, okay, well, there's no vulnerability whatsoever, you're very well protected. We will also, of course, say that and give kudos. But it is always up to the managing body. They are the deciders.
Right, but What if someone does the risk identification and the risk analysis perfectly, but their risk evaluation is off the charts and they would like to turn their already pretty secure site into a fortress?
What I can answer is that sometimes what you think is necessary, for instance, upping all security measures and having military police walk across the street and having a lot of these high bollards on the street and having roadblocks and everything feels like you're securing the place, but it doesn't feel like that to the public. So the public that walks in these open spaces, as I said, it is accessible to all and it should have an open character. I think sometimes people tend to think in an actuarial way. So they want to insure everything. They want to insure all the risks and they want to make sure that nothing can ever happen. But I think sometimes then you are not achieving your goal. I think the main goal should be of securing public spaces should be the people in those public spaces, and they should feel secured. And I don't think that using all types of extra security measures is allowed when there's not really a threat, an active threat. I hope that answers your question.
Oh, I think it absolutely does, but allow me to follow up on that anyway, a little more at least. Does this process only work in one direction? Or does that mean that you can also theoretically use vulnerability assessments to reduce security measures in a place? When the threat landscape has changed and you think, oh, maybe those bollards there from 10 or 20 years ago aren't really necessary anymore, and we might find a better solution here.
Well, I actually think you're touching a very valuable point there, because as I mentioned earlier, the risk assessment should be a continuous process. So in this continuous process, it can occur that threats that were threats 3 years ago are not threats now, or what was criminalized 15 years ago is not an official crime anymore now. So if you have taken security measures 15 years ago, they might not be applicable now anymore, of course.
Well, so how often should you do a vulnerability assessment then?
What I think is that in case of an active threat, it is very wise to immediately conduct a vulnerability assessment for each phase surrounding your public space of interest. But as for the continuous assessment, it's always good to build a security plan. And in a security plan, you can just mention, okay, well, these are the goals of our security plan. It should be a continuous process, but in each cycle of that risk assessment, for instance, we want this and this and this information, and that information can be, okay, so what's the national level of threat? For instance, for terrorism. Certain cities were super safe 10 years ago, maybe, and are now considered as one of the highest risks for terrorist attacks. So I would always advise to make it a continuous process. If I can advise it, I would do it every month, maybe every week, to keep it safe for everyone.
I think that's a beautiful closing statement and a fantastic place to end on. But before we go, for those who want to find out a little more about your work and your organization and today's topic, could you point us to some resources, and where do we find you online?
Well, you can go to www.ditss.nl, and I would also advise to visit the Protect Project's website. There's a lot of information regarding the protection of public space there, and that is www.protect-cities.eu, and securipedia.eu is very important.
Wonderful. We'll link to all of those in the show notes. Vivian, thank you so much for taking the time and walking me through the basics of risk and vulnerability assessments. I really appreciate it.
Yes, me too. Thank you.
Thank you very much for joining us. For additional information on our partners' work and the Secu4All project, please follow the links in the description. Secu4All is funded by the European Union's Internal Security Fund and coordinated by Efus, the European Forum for Urban Security. You can find us online at efus.eu or on Twitter under @EfusNews. That's @EFUSNEWS. This episode was produced and recorded by me, Lauren Schätzle, for the German European Forum for Urban Security, with the kind support of the Secu4All project team at Efus.